once you've had all the fun of the piecing and you've assembled it all into your quilt top, then comes the part of the quilting, and this is where a lot of people come unstuck, and I certainly do. I have sort of hours where I stare into the abyss and wonder how the heck I'm going to quilt it. But there's a series of questions you can ask yourself, and that will help you get to the point where you can get started and actually quilt it. So one of the first questions you should ask is, how am I going to quilt it? And this will solve a lot of your problems further down the track. So as I see it, you could decide, I've loved piecing my quilt top, but I don't want to quilt it myself. I'm going to send it out for someone else to quilt. That's perfect. It's off your hands. Someone else is going to do the business. But if you decide that you love quilting and you want to quilt it yourself, then you've got a number of other questions to ask yourself. And I usually ask, the first question is, am I going to use the walking foot or am I going to free motion quilt it? So am I going to sew mainly straight lines, or am I going to get into my free motion quilting and do lots of feathers and leaves and flowers? Well, for this quilt, because it's quite geometric, I've decided that I'm going to use the walking foot. It's quite a quick sort of process. It's easy once you get going, and because this is a present for my my niece's 21st birthday, I don't want to spend 6 months quilting it and faffing around, because I just want to get it done in a couple of days. And the walking foot is a great tool to use for that. So I'm going to quilt it, I'm going to use the walking foot, and what am I going to use on it? So I'm going to then talk about threads. I've decided to use my lovely stash of these Madeira polyneon threads. I love these threads because they're really strong colours, they wash well, and they don't fluff, so you don't have to keep cleaning your machine every 10 minutes because there's cotton fluff everywhere. I think they're great. They come in terrific colours, and there's about 1,000 metres per spool, and they're not terribly expensive, available throughout New Zealand and Australia, so they're a really good choice for me, and they work really well with the particular fabrics that I've chosen for this. What I like about walking foot quilting or free motion quilting yourself is that you can really tailor the quilting to the quilt top, and the quilt top tells you really what it needs. So after I've pieced everything together, I always like to make a little sandwich, which is sort of a sample piece. I always make a few too many squares and sew them together, and I put exactly the same fabric as I'm going to use on the quilt on the back of the fabric. So I always have enough bit of fabric left over, even if I've got to piece it, in order to make a back and the front, because that way when I start doing up my sample, I can see how my back thread works, how my front threads work, and how the tension is going, and I often recheck the tension several times while I'm quilting it. For the back of this quilt, I don't want the quilting to really stand out because the fabric's so beautiful. So I'm going to use what they call a monopoly, which is a bit like a fine fishing line. This one's got a smoky colour, so it beds in well to the grey background, and it kind of disappears, but it still has that quilting look. And then on the front, you know, I'm going to work out my design, and that's what we talk about, the what of the quilting. I've decided how I'm going to quilt it, and now I've got to decide what I'm going to quilt. Just as a quick word, here's some examples of other quilts that I've made, and their quilting sandwich. Look how crazy it gets after a while. It's just when I change threads, if I'm using metallic threads or I start to do free motion quilting, I need to constantly check the tension. So here's another one. This is one that I did a lot of free motion quilting on, needed a lot of testing. The shirty quilt. It's very thick, and I've used a lot of different threads on the back to work out which ones to make. So I find the quilting sandwich sample is useful, and it's also a little bit of that quilt that you can keep forever and go back to if you want to check on a different way of quilting, or you want to check how you did something. You can always use your sample then. So we've still got to decide what to actually quilt on it. And I've decided with this quilt that I'm going to use the shapes of the piecing in order to be my lines that I'm going to quilt on. I'm not going to chalk up a whole lot of lines or mark a whole lot of lines on it. I'm just going to use the lines that are already there and quilt along those. It's pretty straightforward. So here's a graphic of what the quilt's going to look like, and I'm going to use felt pens to draw along some lines and see if I can get the best sample that I can get without having to actually quilt on it and then decide later I don't like it and unpick it. nobody likes reverse stitching. So initially, straight away, I can see on here that we've got straight lines, and straight lines are easy as, so I'm just going to draw along those and make a note of what colours I'm going to do those. And the other great thing about drawing on some straight lines and sewing straight down them is that it's sort of like a foundation line which holds your quilt together and also gets rid of a lot of your safety pins right from the get-go, so that's worth doing. So straight away I'm going to do some straight lines along here. My straight lines are going to jump a little bit from one side to the other because I want them to stay on the one colour. So that's one side, and here we are. This is going to come along like this. I'm top stitching so I can see those bits, and then I'm going to come the other way and I'm going to be doing some straight lines on those like that, down here, down here, down here. That looks like it'll be easy as. That's half the job done, putting the straight lines on. So that's going to look terrific. And then I decided, okay, for free motion quilting or for walking foot, the best thing you can possibly do is use a continuous line because there's less stopping and starting. You don't have to keep tying off threads. You don't have to keep restarting your thread. So just to have some kind of pattern that you can sew in a continuous line just makes the job all that much easier. So I'm going to maybe go in a diagonal there, and then I'm going to come along that line of the arrow and then cross the two arrows, come along this line, go down here, across there. Look, I'm just not stopping. It'll just be terrific. I can just keep going like that. And I'll be doing the same with this one. It'll come down, it'll go across, it'll come down, it'll go across, a bit like that. That'll be great. Okay, so I could do that on each line, like that. That'll be great. And then I'm going to get another colour. Then I'm going to be turning the quilt around and I'm going to go in this direction now. So come down here, go across there, here, go across there. Let's see if that'll do it. That's basically all of my colours taken up on that quilt. All of the lines will be quilted. And because some of this quilt is plain black, the top stitching will appear as a colour on the black, which I think will be quite a nice graphic look. The other thing worth noting about quilting is that I'm a complete failure when it comes to stitching in the ditch. For decades, quilters were told, stitch in the ditch, you'll hide your quilting. I don't want to hide the quilting on this, I want to see the quilting. And I find it really hard to stitch in the ditch. The needle goes all over the place. Sometimes it comes up out of the ditch, sometimes it swerves. So I found it a lot easier to actually just top stitch. Top stitch straight on the top of your seams. You can eyeball it, get a pretty straight line. It'll look fabulous. So, here's my permission. You can abandon stitching in the ditch. Stitch wherever you want. Don't worry about the ditch. So let's go to the sewing machine and see what that looks like.